Story 1: The Whispering Trees of Dyatlov Pass. It started with a whisper, just a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustle of leaves in a breeze that wasn't there. But by the end, it was a scream, a chorus of them, rising from the ancient, gnarled trees that surrounded us. They say the forest remembers. They say it hungers. And now, as I sit here, the last one left, I can still hear them. The trees, whispering, calling, waiting. It was Jake who found the blog post. Of course it was. Jake was always the one digging up obscure, creepy stories online, the kind that made you laugh nervously but kept you awake at night. He sent it to the group chat with the caption, "Who's up for a little adventure?" The post was titled, "The Unsolved Mystery of Dyatlov Pass." What really happened in the Ural Mountains? It detailed the infamous 1959 incident where 9 experienced hikers died under bizarre and unexplained circumstances. Their tent was found torn open from the inside, their bodies scattered in the snow, some with inexplicable injuries, crushed ribs, a missing tongue, radiation burns. The official explanation was an unknown compelling force, but the blog speculated about something darker, something alive. The post ended with a tantalizing hook. But what if the Dyatlov Pass wasn't an isolated incident? What if there are other places like it, places where the forest itself is alive and hungry? Jake, being Jake, had already mapped out a location, a remote stretch of forest in the Ural Mountains eerily similar to the Dyatlov Pass. "It's not the exact spot," he said, "but it's close enough. And get this, locals say the trees there move." We laughed it off. Of course we did. But 2 weeks later, there we were, me, Jake, Sarah, Chris, and Emma, standing at the edge of that godforsaken forest, our breath visible in the cold autumn air. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals, just the occasional creak of branches in the wind. We set up camp in a small clearing near a cluster of ancient, gnarled trees. Their twisted trunks looked almost human, like frozen figures caught in mid-scream. "Cheerful place," Chris joked, but his voice wavered. Even he, the eternal skeptic, seemed uneasy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we lit a fire and cracked open a few beers. Jake, ever the storyteller, began recounting the Dyatlov Pass incident in gruesome detail. Sarah rolled her eyes but listened anyway. Emma, the most practical of the group, checked the map and reminded us we had a long hike ahead tomorrow. That's when we heard it. A whisper. We all froze. It was faint, almost like the wind, but there was something deliberate about it, like words we couldn't quite make out. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper herself. "It's just the wind," Chris said, but he didn't sound convinced. We tried to brush it off, but the whispers grew louder as the night wore on. They seemed to come from the trees themselves, a chorus of faint, pleading voices. "Help us, help us, help us." "Okay, that's it," Emma said, standing up. "I'm going to bed. This is freaking me out." We all agreed, though none of us slept much that night. The next morning, Chris was gone. His tent was still there, but the zipper was torn open from the inside, just like in the Dyatlov Pass incident. His sleeping bag was crumpled on the ground, and his boots were missing. We called his name, searched the surrounding area, but there was no sign of him. "Maybe he went for a walk?" Sarah suggested, though her face was pale. "Without his phone or his backpack?" I countered. We found his footprints leading into the forest, but they stopped abruptly, as if he'd been lifted off the ground. And then we noticed something else. The trees around the campsite seemed closer. Their branches stretched toward us like skeletal hands. "This is insane," Jake said, but even he looked shaken. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't just pleading now, they were angry. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come." Sarah was the next to vanish. We heard her scream in the middle of the night, a sound that was cut off abruptly. By the time we reached her tent, she was gone. All that remained was a single, bloodied diary entry scrawled in her handwriting. "The trees are alive, and they're hungry." By the third day, we were down to 3, me, Jake, and Emma. We tried to leave, but the forest seemed to shift around us, the trees closing in like a living maze. The whispers were constant now, a cacophony of voices that made it impossible to think. "We need to find out what's happening," Jake said, his voice trembling. "There has to be a reason." We stumbled upon an old, crumbling cabin deep in the forest. Inside, we found journals dating back decades, all telling the same story. Hikers who had vanished, their last words warning of the trees. One journal mentioned a local legend about a cursed grove, a place where the spirits of the dead were trapped, their souls absorbed by the trees. The trees, the journal claimed, were alive, and they fed on the living. "This is insane," Emma whispered, but her eyes were wide with terror. That night, Jake disappeared. We heard him screaming, his voice echoing through the forest. When we found his tent, it was shredded, and his footprints led straight to the base of one of the ancient trees. Its roots were stained with blood. Emma and I tried to make a run for it, but the forest was against us. The trees seemed to move, their branches reaching out to block our path. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices screaming in our minds. Emma tripped, and before I could help her, the roots of a tree wrapped around her legs, dragging her into the earth. Her screams were cut off as the ground swallowed her whole. I ran, my heart pounding, until I collapsed at the edge of the forest. When I looked back, the trees were still, their branches swaying gently in the wind. But I knew the truth. They were watching, waiting. I'm the only one who made it out. The authorities didn't believe my story, of course. They said it was a tragic hiking accident, that my friends got lost and succumbed to the elements. But I know better. I can still hear the whispers, even now, miles away from that cursed forest. They're faint, but they're there. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the trees, their gnarled branches reaching out, their roots stained with blood. They're alive, and they're hungry. Story 2: The Fire That Didn't Burn. It started with a story, a campfire tale, the kind meant to send shivers down your spine but leave you laughing by the end. Grandpa's voice was low and gravelly, his eyes reflecting the flickering flames as he told us about his childhood friend who burst into flames one night, right there by the fire. We laughed it off, of course. But the next morning, when I woke up to find my sleeping bag scorched and my skin covered in ash, I stopped laughing. Because Grandpa's story wasn't just a story. And the fire wasn't just a fire. The Johnson family reunion was an annual tradition, a weekend of hiking, fishing, and storytelling at the old cabin in the woods. This year, there were 10 of us. Grandpa, my parents, my Uncle Dave and Aunt Karen, my cousins Megan and Tyler, and me. The cabin was cozy but creaky, its wooden walls lined with faded photographs and dusty antlers. Outside, the forest loomed, dark and endless. On the first night, we gathered around the campfire, its orange glow casting long shadows on the ground. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that makes you huddle closer to the flames. Grandpa, as usual, was the center of attention. At 78, he was a wiry man with a face like cracked leather and a voice that could command a room. "You kids ever heard of spontaneous human combustion?" he asked, his eyes glinting in the firelight. We groaned. "Not this again," Uncle Dave said, rolling his eyes. But Grandpa ignored him. "Back when I was a boy, maybe 12 or so, I had a friend named Tommy. We used to camp out in the woods just like this. One night, we were sitting by the fire, roasting marshmallows, when Tommy, well, he just burst into flames. The fire crackled, and for a moment, no one spoke. "Come on, Dad," my mom said, laughing nervously. "You're scaring the kids." But Grandpa wasn't laughing. "I'm serious." One minute, Tommy was fine. The next, he was screaming, his whole body on fire. And here's the thing, the fire didn't burn anything else. Just Tommy. When it was over, there was nothing left but a pile of ash. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of the fire popping and hissing. Even Uncle Dave looked uneasy. "That's enough, Grandpa," my dad said firmly. "Let's not ruin the trip with your tall tales." Grandpa shrugged, but his eyes stayed on the fire, as if he were seeing something the rest of us couldn't. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tommy, a faceless figure engulfed in flames, his screams echoing in my mind. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with fire. I woke up to the smell of smoke. At first, I thought the cabin was on fire. I bolted upright, my heart pounding, but the room was dark and quiet. The smell was coming from my sleeping bag. I yanked it off and stared in horror. The fabric was scorched, blackened in places, as if it had been held over a flame. And my skin was covered in a fine layer of ash. I stumbled out of bed, my hands trembling. "Mom! Dad!" I shouted, my voice cracking. They came running along with everyone else. Grandpa was the last to arrive, his face pale as he stared at the scorched sleeping bag. "What happened?" my mom asked, her voice shrill. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "I just woke up like this." Grandpa didn't say a word. He just looked at the sleeping bag, then at me, his expression unreadable. The next day, no one wanted to talk about what had happened. We tried to go about our usual activities, hiking, fishing, playing board games, but the mood was tense. I couldn't stop thinking about the ash on my skin, the way it had felt warm to the touch. By that evening, the heat started. It began as a faint warmth in my chest, like the embers of a dying fire. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as the hours passed, it grew stronger. By nightfall, it felt like I had a furnace burning inside me. I wasn't the only one. Megan complained of feeling hot, even though the cabin was chilly. Tyler said his hands felt like they were on fire. Even Uncle Dave, who had laughed off Grandpa's story, admitted he felt off. "It's probably just a bug," my dad said, but he didn't sound convinced. Grandpa stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the fire. The next morning, Megan was gone. We found her sleeping bag in the same state as mine, scorched and covered in ash. But Megan herself was nowhere to be found. We searched the cabin, the woods, the lake, but there was no sign of her. "This isn't funny, Megan," Aunt Karen shouted, her voice breaking. "Come out right now." But Megan didn't come out, because Megan wasn't there. That night, the heat inside me grew unbearable. It felt like my blood was boiling, my skin on the verge of catching fire. I could see the same fear in Tyler's eyes, in Uncle Dave's. Even Grandpa looked uneasy. "We need to leave," my dad said, his voice firm. "Now." But when we tried to leave, the car wouldn't start. The radio crackled with static, and the air outside was thick with the smell of smoke. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees swaying in a wind that didn't exist. By the third day, the heat was unbearable. Tyler collapsed, his skin red and blistered, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Uncle Dave tried to carry him to the car, but he stumbled and fell, his own body racked with pain. "What's happening to us?" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. Grandpa finally spoke. "It's the fire," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just a fire. It's something else. Something ancient." "What are you talking about?" my mom demanded. Grandpa looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I didn't want to believe it, not after all these years. But it's true. The fire, it's alive. It feeds on warmth, on life. And once it's inside you, there's no escape." "You knew?" my dad shouted, his face red with anger. "You knew and you didn't say anything?" "I thought it was just a story," Grandpa said, his voice breaking. I didn't think it would come back." That night, the fire came for us. It started with Tyler. One minute, he was lying on the couch, his breathing shallow. The next, he was screaming, his body engulfed in flames. The fire didn't spread. It just consumed him, leaving nothing but ash. Uncle Dave was next, then Aunt Karen, then my parents. One by one, they burned, their screams echoing in the night. Grandpa and I were the last ones left. The heat inside me was unbearable, my vision blurring as the fire consumed me from within. "I'm sorry," Grandpa said, his voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." And then he was gone, his body vanishing in a burst of flames. I'm the only one left. The fire spared me, though I don't know why. Maybe it wanted a witness. Maybe it wanted me to tell the story. But the heat is still there, simmering beneath my skin. I can feel it growing stronger every day. A reminder that the fire isn't done with me yet. They say fire purifies. They say it cleanses. But they're wrong. Fire doesn't purify, consumes. And once it's inside you, there's no escape. Story: The Shadow in the Smoke. It wasn't the fog that scared us at first. It was the silence. The way it swallowed every sound. The crackle of the fire, the rustle of leaves, even our own voices. And then we saw it. A shadow moving through the trees. At first, we thought it was just a trick of the light, a figment of our imaginations. But it kept getting closer and closer, and then it started to mimic us. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. The fog had already taken hold, and the shadow was one of us. The Smoky Mountains were supposed to be a paradise. Towering peaks, dense forests, and trails that seemed to stretch on forever. For 5 college friends, me, Rachel, Mark, Jess, and Tyler, it was the perfect escape from finals week. We'd been planning the trip for months, mapping out trails, packing gear, and dreaming of campfires under the stars. We arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the mountains. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that makes you feel alive. We hiked for about an hour before finding the perfect spot. A small clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a view of the valley below. "This is it," Rachel said, dropping her backpack. "Home sweet home." We set up camp quickly, pitching tents, gathering firewood, and cooking dinner over the portable stove. As the sun set, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, perfect, and then the fog rolled in. It started as a thin mist, creeping through the trees like a living thing. At first, we didn't think much of it. Fog was common in the Smokies, especially at night. But this was different. It was thicker, denser, almost unnatural. "Weird," Mark said, staring into the trees. "I've never seen fog like this." "It's just fog," Tyler said, shrugging. "It'll burn off by morning." But it didn't. If anything, it grew thicker, swallowing the trees and the stars above. The fire, which had been roaring just minutes ago, seemed dimmer, its light struggling to penetrate the mist. That's when we saw it. A shadow moving through the trees. At first, it was just a flicker, a dark shape against the gray. We all froze, our eyes fixed on the spot where it had been. "Did you see that?" Jess whispered. "Probably just a bear," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. We called out, our voices echoing strangely in the fog. "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no response, just the faint sound of footsteps, moving closer. The shadow didn't disappear. It stayed at the edge of the clearing, just visible through the fog. We tried to ignore it, telling ourselves it was just a hiker or an animal. But as the night wore on, it began to mimic us. It started with small movements. Rachel would shift her weight, and the shadow would do the same. Mark would raise his hand, and the shadow would raise its arm. At first, it was almost funny. We laughed nervously, trying to convince ourselves it was just a trick of the light. But then it started getting closer. "This isn't funny anymore," Jess said, her voice trembling. "What the hell is that thing?" "I don't know," I said, my eyes never leaving the shadow. "But I don't like it." We decided to stay close to the fire, huddling together for warmth and safety. But the fog was relentless, pressing in on us from all sides. The shadow stayed just outside the circle of light, its movements growing more deliberate, more human. The first to go was Tyler. He'd been quiet all night, his eyes fixed on the shadow. When he stood up and walked into the fog, we thought he was just going to the bathroom. "Tyler, wait," Rachel called after him. "Don't go too far." But he didn't stop. He just kept walking, his figure fading into the mist. We waited for him to come back, and waited, and waited. "We should go after him," Jess said, her voice shaking. "No," Mark said firmly. "We stay together. It's too dangerous." But staying together didn't save us. Rachel was next. She'd been staring at the shadow, her eyes wide with fear. When it raised its arm, she raised hers. When it took a step forward, she did the same. "Rachel, stop!" I shouted, grabbing her arm. But she shook me off, her eyes blank. "I have to go," she said, her voice distant. "It's calling me." And then she was gone, swallowed by the fog. By morning, it was just me, Mark, and Jess. The fog was thicker than ever, the shadow now just a few feet away. It looked almost human, its features blurred but recognizable. It was us, all of us, Tyler, Rachel, even Mark and Jess. It was like looking into a funhouse mirror, our reflections twisted and wrong. "We need to leave," Mark said, his voice desperate. "Now." But when we tried to leave, the fog closed in around us, the trees shifting and changing direction. We were lost, trapped in a nightmare. Jess was the next to go. She'd been crying, her hands pressed to her ears as if trying to block out a sound only she could hear. When the shadow reached out to her, she reached back. "Jess, no!" I screamed, but it was too late. She stepped into the fog, her hand clasping the shadows. And then she was gone. Mark and I were the last ones left. The shadow was so close now, its face almost clear. It was me, my reflection, staring back at me with empty eyes. "I'm not going to let it take me," Mark said, his voice shaking. "I'm not." But when the shadow reached for him, he didn't fight it. He just stepped forward, his hand clasping its outstretched arm. And then he was gone. I was alone. The fog began to lift, the sun breaking through the trees. The shadow was gone, the clearing eerily quiet. I stumbled to the campfire, now just a pile of ashes, and found something lying in the embers. Polaroid photo. It was a picture of us taken the night before. We were all there, Rachel, Mark, Jess, Tyler, and me. But there was someone else in the photo too. A shadowy figure, standing just behind us, its hand resting on Tyler's shoulder. And it was smiling. I don't know how I made it out of the forest. I don't remember walking, or calling for help, or being found by the park rangers. All I remember is the fog and the shadow and the photo. They say the Smoky Mountains are full of mysteries. Unexplained disappearances, strange lights, eerie fog. But I know the truth. The forest isn't just alive. It's hungry. And the shadow is always waiting. I keep the photo with me, a reminder of what happened. Sometimes, when I look at it, I swear the shadow moves. The smile grows wider. His eyes meet mine. And I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me. Story 4: The Curse of the Blackwater Lake. They say Blackwater Lake is cursed. They say the water is alive, that it remembers the dead. We didn't believe it, not at first. But when we felt those cold, bony fingers brush against our legs, when we heard the whispers rising from the depths, we knew the stories were true. The lake doesn't just drown you, it takes you, and once it has you, there's no escape. Blackwater Lake was the kind of place you only heard about in whispers. Tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, it was a place of eerie beauty, its dark, glassy surface reflecting the towering pines that surrounded it. But beneath that beauty lay a dark history. The legend was simple. Decades ago, a cult had used the lake for their rituals. They drowned their victims in its icy waters, their bodies sinking to the bottom, never to be found. When the cult was finally discovered, the lake was declared cursed, a place where the restless spirits of the dead waited to claim new victims. "It's just a story," I said, rolling my eyes as my friend Jake recounted the legend. "A bunch of nonsense to scare tourists." "Maybe," Jake said, his voice low, "but people have disappeared here, drowned, and their bodies, they're never found." We were sitting around a campfire, the 5 of us, me, Jake, Sarah, Chris, and Emma. It was our annual camping trip, and this year we'd chosen Blackwater Lake. None of us believed in curses or restless spirits. We were here for the adventure, but the lake had other plans. The first night was uneventful. We set up camp, cooked dinner, and told stories around the fire. The lake was calm, its surface like black glass under the moonlight. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. Let's go for a swim, Chris said, grinning. It's a full moon. Perfect night for it. Are you crazy? Sarah said, her eyes wide. Did you not hear the story Jake just told? Come on, Chris said, standing up. It's just a story. Besides, it's hot out. The water will feel great. I hesitated. The lake did look inviting, its dark surface shimmering in the moonlight. But there was something off about it. Something that made my skin crawl. I'm in, Jake said, standing up. Let's do it. Emma and I exchanged a look. Fine, I said reluctantly. But if I get eaten by a lake monster, I'm haunting all of you. We stripped down to our swimsuits and waded into the water. It was cold, the kind of cold that takes your breath away. But after a few minutes, it felt refreshing. See, Chris said, splashing water at Sarah. Nothing to worry about. But then I felt it. Something brushed against my leg. It wasn't a fish. It was too deliberate, too cold. Did you feel that? I asked, my voice trembling. Feel what? Jake said, laughing. And then he screamed. It was chaos. Jake was thrashing in the water, his face twisted in terror. Something's got me, he shouted. Something's pulling me under. We swam toward him, but the water seemed to resist us, as if it were alive. I felt it again. Cold, bony fingers brushing against my legs, my arms, my back. They were everywhere, pulling at me, dragging me down. Get out, Sarah screamed. Get out of the water. We swam for shore, our hearts pounding, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. But Jake wasn't with us. He was still out there, screaming, thrashing, disappearing beneath the surface. Jake, I shouted, my voice breaking. Jake, swim. But he didn't. He just vanished. We spent the rest of the night searching for Jake, calling his name, shining flashlights across the dark water. But there was no sign of him. It was like the lake had swallowed him whole. By morning, we were exhausted, our voices hoarse from shouting. The lake was calm again, its surface smooth and unbroken. We need to call for help, Sarah said, her face pale. We can't do this alone. But when we tried to use our phones, there was no signal. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees towering and oppressive. We're on our own, Chris said, his voice grim. We found Jake's body the next morning. It was lying on the shore, his face frozen in a mask of terror. His skin was pale, almost blue, and his eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. What the hell happened to him? Emma whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer, couldn't, because I knew. The lake had taken him, and it wasn't done with us. We buried Jake as best we could, using sticks and rocks to mark the grave. But as we stood there, staring at the makeshift memorial, I felt it again, the cold, bony fingers brushing against my legs. We need to leave, Sarah said, her voice shaking. Now. But when we tried to leave, the forest seemed to shift around us, the trees closing in like a living maze. The lake was calling us, its whispers rising from the depths. You shouldn't have come, the voices said. You shouldn't have come. By nightfall, we were back at the lake. The water was calm, its surface like black glass. But we knew the truth. The lake wasn't calm. It was waiting. We have to end this, Chris said, his voice firm. We have to destroy it. But how do you destroy a lake? How do you fight something that's alive? We tried everything, fire, rocks, even a makeshift raft. But nothing worked. The lake just absorbed it all. And then it came for us. Sarah was the first to go. She'd been standing at the water's edge, staring into the depths. When the hands reached out for her, she didn't fight. She just stepped forward, her eyes blank. Sarah, no! I screamed, but it was too late. She was gone. I'm the only one left. The lake took the others one by one. Chris, Emma, even Jake. They're all gone. But the lake isn't done with me. I can feel it. Even now, its cold, bony fingers brushing against my skin. Its whispers in my ears. You shouldn't have come, it says. You shouldn't have come. And I know it's only a matter of time before it takes me too. Story 5: The radio transmission from nowhere. It started with a voice, a faint, crackling voice, reciting numbers in a monotone loop. We laughed it off, thinking it was just some weird radio signal. But then it called my name, and then it called the others. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. The voice wasn't just coming from the radio, it was coming from the woods, and it wasn't alone. The old radio was a relic, a vintage piece of equipment Jake had found at a flea market. It was bulky, with a wooden casing and a dial that clicked as you turned it. We'd brought it along on our camping trip as a joke, a way to add some retro charm to our nights around the fire. "Who needs Spotify when you've got this beauty?" Jake said, grinning as he set the radio on a tree stump. We laughed, but there was something eerie about the radio. It looked out of place in the forest, its polished wood and brass knobs gleaming in the firelight. "Do you think it even works?" Sarah asked, her voice skeptical. "Only one way to find out," Jake said, plugging it in and turning the dial. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, we heard a voice. The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the static. It was a man's voice, deep and monotone, reciting a series of numbers. 7, 4, 2, 9, 3. We all froze, our eyes fixed on the radio. "What the hell is that?" Chris asked, his voice low. "It's a numbers station," I said, remembering something I'd read online. "There are these weird radio stations that broadcast numbers. No one knows who runs them or what the numbers mean." "Creepy," Sarah said, shivering. "Turn it off." But Jake didn't. He kept listening, his eyes wide with fascination. "This is so cool," he said. "It's like we're spies or something." The voice continued, the numbers looping over and over. It was hypnotic in a way, the monotone drone lulling us into a strange sense of calm. And then it called my name. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. The voice had been so faint, so distorted. But then it called Jake's name, and Sarah's, and Chris's. We all froze, our eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered. "It's just a prank," Chris said, though his voice was shaking. "Someone's messing with us." But the voice wasn't just calling our names. It was saying things it shouldn't know. "Sarah, you're afraid of the dark. Jake, you're hiding something. Chris, you're lying to yourself." And then it said my name again. "Emily, you miss him. You miss your father." I felt a chill run down my spine. My father had died in a hiking accident years ago. How could the voice know that? The voice grew louder, more distorted, the numbers and names blending together into a cacophony of sound. And then suddenly it stopped. For a moment there was silence. And then the radio began to emit screams. They were horrible, blood-curdling screams, the kind that make your stomach churn. We all backed away from the radio, our eyes wide with terror. "Turn it off," Sarah shouted, her voice breaking. But Jake couldn't. The dial was stuck, the screams growing louder and louder. And then the fire went out. The campsite was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the radio. The screams continued, echoing through the trees. "We need to get out of here," Chris said, his voice trembling. But when we tried to leave, the forest seemed to shift around us, the trees closing in like a living maze. The screams were everywhere, coming from the radio, from the woods, from inside our heads. And then we saw them, shadows moving through the trees. They were tall, impossibly tall, their forms shifting and changing with every step. They didn't walk, they glided, their movements smooth and unnatural. "What the hell are those things?" Jake whispered, his voice shaking. But no one answered. We were too scared to speak. The shadows came closer, their forms becoming clearer. They were humanoid but wrong, their limbs too long, their faces featureless. They reached out for us, their fingers cold and bony. Sarah was the first to go. She screamed as the shadows surrounded her, her voice cut off abruptly. Jake was next, then Chris. I was the last one left. I tried to run, but the shadows were everywhere, their whispers filling my ears. "Emily, you miss him. You miss your father." And then I saw him, my father. He was standing there, his face pale, his eyes empty. "Dad," I whispered, my voice trembling. But he didn't answer. He just reached out for me, his fingers cold and bony. And then everything went black. When the sun rose, the campsite was empty. The fire was cold, the tents torn to shreds. The radio was found smashed, its casing cracked and broken. Scratched into the wood was a single phrase: "They're here now. No one knows what happened to us. No one knows where we went." But if you go to that campsite, if you listen closely, you might hear it, the faint, crackling voice reciting numbers in a monotone loop. And if you're not careful, it might call your name.